lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. In this video, we're going to complete our examination of Plato's Phaedo. Now, so far, what we have largely focused on in the last 3 videos are the major arguments that Plato uses to prove the soul is immortal, and therefore also show his friends that they really have no need to fear that his death will be a bad thing for him. In fact, he will survive his death, and if he is right, he'll be promised the greatest blessings. Now, in his view, the reason for this is because, 1, the soul can exist apart from the body. He uses the cyclical argument and argument from recollection to show this. And then, as we saw in our previous video, he uses the affinity argument to say, well, not only can the soul exist apart from the body, but given what we know about the soul, given the sort of thing it is, as he says, given that's an invisible reality, and that invisible things are also unchangeable, they are simple, they don't even have any parts, and therefore cannot be destroyed. Given all that, we know the soul cannot be destroyed, it cannot go out of existence, and so therefore it must exist forever, it must be eternal, it must be immortal. So in terms of heavy philosophical lifting, those 3 arguments really are the most technical and abstract parts of the dialogue. But in this video, I'm going to focus less on those arguments, although I have a few things to say about the affinity argument. And I want to focus on some comments that Plato makes after he gives the affinity argument on the relationship between the body and the soul. Because thus far we've seen Plato give arguments for why these 2 things are distinct, why they're separate, but he's also suggested there must be some relationship between them. Right? As we're going to see, he thinks that the soul is in some sense the ruler or master over the body. Our soul accounts for our reasoning processes, whereas our body accounts for our desires. And if there is going to be this conflict between using our reason to gain knowledge, using our reason to tell us what the right thing to do is, using our reason to combat our passion, to combat our desires, to fight temptation. If all that's going to be true, then there has to be some sort of relationship between the body and the soul. They must interact in some way. And in this video, we're going to examine that relationship, or at least how Plato conceives of it. Okay, so there are a few things that Plato says. There's really 2 main claims he makes about the soul and the body, and specifically their relationship. So the first thing he says is that the soul is the ruler of the body. And let's look at the passage here. So Plato says, look at it also this way. When the soul and body are together, nature orders the one to be the subject and one to be ruled, and the other to rule and be master. Then again, which do you think is like the divine and which like the mortal? Do you not think that the nature of the divine is to rule and lead, whereas it is of that of the mortal to be ruled and be subject? Now, which does the soul resemble? Obviously, Socrates, the soul resembles the divine and the body resembles the mortal. So he makes a couple claims here. First, he says that by nature there's a sort of hierarchy where certain elements are meant to rule or command, and other elements are meant to follow or be subject. And he says that which is most divine should be commanding, should be ruling and leading, and that which is not divine, which is mortal, which is temporary and changing, that should be ruled. Now, of course, as he goes on to say, you can imagine which of these elements he associates with the soul and which with the body. The soul, as we've seen, is like the forms. It's eternal, it's unchanging. It is a sort of divine element in us. It's responsible for our reasoning processes, those processes which he thinks separate us from all the rest of the animal world. On the other hand, our body is much more like the rest of the animal world. It comes into being and it perishes or it goes out of existence. It is temporary, it is constantly changing. And if he's right, if the senses are in fact associated with the body, then also the body continually leads us astray and into false conceptions, because the senses can be deceiving. So the claim he makes here is that if we think that what is most divine should rule and what is the least divine should be subject or should follow, then the soul is in fact the ruler of the body. And there's a couple ways in which this is true. On the one hand, you might say, well, yeah, there's all sorts of ways in which, if you think about the soul or the mind or the brain or whatever you want to call it, in many ways does control the body, right? So when you have a thought or you have a certain desire, for instance, I want to have a sandwich for lunch. That's a thought you form in your head, a desire that you form in your mind, and your mind then puts your body into action in going about and satisfying that desire. So there's a straightforward way in which you might say the soul is the ruler of the body, but there's also a more complex way, because it also pertains to how ought we to best order our lives. And we've seen, and Plato is picking up on a very important Socratic theme here. Socrates has emphasized that what is truly important in life are not is not wealth or power or honor or pleasure, any of those things that are really associated with the body and sensual goods. Rather, what really matters is virtue. What matters is using our reason to live correctly. And so for this reason, as we've seen in Socrates, and now really Plato is picking up on this idea, what it means for us to live a good life is for our soul to be in the best possible condition. Whatever it is that is good for the soul, that should orient our life. Whatever is good for the body should largely be ignored as far as possible, and really, as we're going to see as we move through these passages, should be rejected as much as we can. Now, there's one other point I want to make about this idea that, in fact, the soul should be the ruler of the body. And I want to make this by going back to the affinity argument, because I think to some extent it might cause somewhat of a problem or a tension for Plato. Now, you remember that one of the important claims or premises of that argument is, if something is invisible, then that thing is immutable. And what this just means is, if something is part of the invisible realm of reality, as we discussed last time, then that thing cannot undergo change. That's what immutable means. And of course, the forms were like this, right? So the forms are these eternal, ideal essences of things which constitute what a thing truly is in itself. The perfect definition of beauty, perfect definition of justice. And these things do not change over time. They're not temporary and perishing. These things are eternal and the same through all times. Now, he also says that the soul is one of these invisible, unchangeable, eternal realities, and that's how he knows that his soul will outlive his body. But now consider the claim that the soul is supposed to rule the body. Well, does that present any sort of challenge? Well, it might. Because think about the act of giving a command, or the act of engaging in ruling. So think about the example I gave earlier, right? You form a desire in your mind to have lunch, and then your mind or your soul makes your body go through the actions by which you have lunch. So think about that whole act. Well, isn't it the case that you didn't have that desire at one point, and then you had the desire? Then you had to deliberate about that desire. You had to think about, well, should I pursue this desire or not? And then you had to actually make the decision to go through with the act. All those steps are various processes that come into being over time. Right? There was one point where you didn't have that desire, you weren't hungry, now you're hungry, and you do have the desire. But doesn't that imply change? If the soul didn't always have that desire, then it must have changed if it now does have that desire. If the soul wasn't always commanding the body to go have lunch, it must have changed if it now is giving that command. And so one of the things I suggested last time, which I think might be a tension here, is that it seems like for Plato to say the soul can't change is at odds with his claim that, in fact, the soul is ruling the body and giving it commands, because the act of giving a command seems to always imply some kind of change. So I think there may be a problem here, right? If you look at the affinity argument, this might be one way in which we say, well, maybe one of those links isn't true. Maybe it's not true that everything that is invisible is really changeless. And of course, if that's not true, then the other links are questionable as well, because he connects being changeless with being simple, and simple with indestructibility. So in any case, putting aside whatever tension this might cause for the argument, let's also look at the other way in which he describes the relationship between the soul and the body. So not only is the soul more divine, and so it should rule the body, but also he says the body, insofar as it acts upon the soul, it pollutes the soul. Now what could that possibly mean? So in the following passage he describes this. He says, what happens is much more like this. If it, the soul, is pure when it leaves the body and drags nothing bodily with it, as if it had no willing association with the body and life, but avoided it and gathered itself together by itself and always practiced this, which is no other than practicing philosophy in the right way, in fact training to die easily. Or is this not training for death? So first he says, here's one approach you might take in life. Right? If you're a philosopher who constantly shuns the body, you don't engage in the pursuit of pleasure or honor or wealth, the fears, the confusions the body fills you with, you attempt to ignore those. You separate yourself from your bodily needs as much as you possibly can. You turn yourself instead, through the use of your reason, toward the forms, and you attempt to understand their eternal essence. If you're doing that, you're training yourself for death, because you are separating your soul from the needs of the body. You're putting the body aside and saying, yes, I know my body's telling me that I really want to eat right now, or I want to sleep, or I want to drink, or I want to have sex, or I want to, or it's making me fearful, it's making me confused, right? I know my body is telling me all these things, but I'm going to reject that. I'm going to not allow my body to dictate what I'm going to do in my life. Instead, I'm going to engage in philosophical discourse aimed at understanding the forms. If you do that, then you're training yourself for death. You're training yourself to leave your body behind. And he says, someone who does this, a soul who does this, a soul that's in this state, continuing on, makes its way to the invisible, which is like itself, the divine and immortal and wise. And arriving there, it can be happy, having rid itself of confusion, ignorance, fear, violent desires, and the other human ills. So if you engage in your whole life in this rejection of the body and an embrace of reason and philosophy, then your soul will make its way back to the invisible realm, back to where the forms are, back to where you can have a culmination of your philosophical mission to finally be acquainted again with the forms and genuine knowledge. But what if you don't live a life like that? What if instead you live a life of pleasure seeking, of satisfying your immediate desires, of food and drink and sex and all the other pleasures and enjoyments that the body is constantly telling you to pursue? What if you give in to fear? What if you give in to hatred and resentment, all the emotions your body makes you feel? So Plato says, but I think that if the soul is polluted and impure when it leaves the body, having always been associated with it and served it, bewitched by physical desires and pleasures to the point at which nothing seems to exist for it but the physical, which one can touch and see or eat or drink and make use of for sexual enjoyment, and if that soul is accustomed to hate and fear and avoid that which is dim and invisible to the eyes, but intelligible and to be grasped by philosophy, do you think that such a soul will escape pure and by itself? Well, of course not. So he's saying if you engage in a life of pleasure seeking, your soul will no longer even be able to recognize that what it truly longs for are the eternal forms. You will begin to think that the only thing there is to reality is the physical. The only thing there is to reality is seeking pleasure. The only thing there is to reality is giving into hatred and fear and resentment. And this is what he means when he says, you will not be able to avoid that which is dim and invisible to the eyes, but intelligible and grasped by philosophy. Your purpose as a soul, as a reasoning being, to attain knowledge and be acquainted with the forms will be dim to you. You won't be able to understand it because all you've done is surround yourself with pleasure. And so to this extent, this is what he means when he says the body pollutes the soul. It confuses the soul. It makes the soul less divine. Now, in one of the most striking passages, because again, if we keep in mind that the soul, technically speaking, is not supposed to be changing. It's supposed to be immutable and changeless. But he says the body can pollute the soul in a way that it can make it heavy and ponderous. So he says, the soul, is no doubt permeated by the physical, which constant intercourse and association with the body, as well as considerable practice, has caused to become ingrained in it. So he says your soul can become permeated, it can become constituted by what's physical if all you do is seek pleasure. And if this is what happens, then we must believe, my friend, that this bodily element is heavy, ponderous, earthly, and visible. And through it, such a soul has become heavy and is dragged back to the visible region. So if you live a life of pleasure seeking and not a life of philosophy, your soul will not escape to become acquainted with the forms. It will not technically escape the realm of visible reality. It'll be too heavy, too ponderous. It'll be weighed down and dragged down. And this is actually the basis of Plato's theory of reincarnation. He essentially thinks that the way you live your life now and the goods you orient yourself toward, do you orient yourself toward philosophy and reason and knowledge and learning? Or do you orient yourself toward pleasure and wealth and honor and reputation and giving into your emotions and fears? Depending on how you live your life is going to depend on what form your soul takes after you die. And he gives a few examples of this. So he says, look, those, for example, who have carelessly practiced gluttony, violence, and drunkenness, he says they'll probably come back in the form of a donkey or some animal like that. He says those who have lived very unjust and immoral lives, those who have esteemed injustice highly and tyranny and plunder, they'll join the tribes of wolves and hawks and kites, or where else should they go? Now he says the happiest of those who don't make it all the way out to the invisible realm to rejoin the forms will become some sort of social animal. So maybe like a bee or an ant or maybe even a human being, right? If you lived a pretty peaceable life, but you didn't live a philosophical life, but you got along with others, you lived a moderate life, you were relatively just, then you might come back as a bee or an ant or maybe some sort of human being who lives a peaceful life. And as far as, going back to the visible realm, that's as good as it gets. But he says, no one may join the company of the gods in the invisible realm with the forms, who has not practiced philosophy, is not completely pure when he departs from life. And the only way to do this is to be a lover of learning. And only those who do this are those who practice philosophy in the right way. They keep away from the bodily passions. So you really can't emphasize enough how much Plato denies the importance of the body, thinks we should reject the body, and says that which often makes our decisions for us, pleasure and pain, that is not what life is about. In fact, it only confuses us and turns us astray from seeking genuine knowledge. And this is the basis of what I'm calling the body as imprisonment metaphor. Right, so in this passage, which I've highlighted here, I won't completely read through this for time's sake, but he makes 3 different claims, each of which constitute this idea that our body is a prison of the soul. So first is just the general claim. One of the things he says in this passage is that the body is a prison for our soul. And we've seen this already, right? Death is an escape if you've lived your life in the correct way, a life of philosophy and reason. But not only this, the soul contributes to its own imprisonment. And this is one of the most striking and one of the most troubling aspects of this imprisonment. Because the reason that you are imprisoned by the body, the reason you might not make it to the invisible realm, that you might be reincarnated in another bodily form, is because you lived a life of seeking pleasure. Which means what is imprisoning you is not some jail guard, it's not some government that's put you in jail, but it is you and your decisions. And if you put aside for the moment, because look, there's a lot of metaphysics here, there's a lot of claims about the soul, which you might accept or reject, but if you just think about it in terms of your own life, just how disturbing that is. Because how often is it that we say to ourselves, I'm doing the wrong thing, I'm making my life worse off, I'm becoming less free, I'm giving into temptation, and I know that it's my fault. I know it's because of the choices I have made that I'm in this situation. And there really is sort of no more disturbing, there's no more disturbing situation to be in. Because you're in a place where you don't want to be, but you feel lost and powerless and out of control. Because you know what you would like your life to be like. Let's say you have, you constantly succumb to temptation for some pleasure, whether it be food or drink or sex or just laziness or sloth. You're constantly succumbing to this temptation. You see how it's making your life worse. And you also see how nobody is putting yourself in this situation except you and the bad habits that you've built up. That is the sort of situation that Plato's describing, whether you accept what he's saying about the soul or not. So we contribute to our own imprisonment in the body. It's our own bad choices that are confusing us. And finally, the only way to free yourself from this imprisonment is through philosophy, is through gaining knowledge, becoming reacquainted with the forms, rejecting the senses, rejecting the pursuit of pleasure that has constituted your life or your lives, depending on how many times you've been reincarnated up to this point. And I want to make just a few other points about how he describes this way in which we imprison ourselves in the body. He says, the soul of the true philosopher thinks that this deliverance must not be opposed, and so keeps away from pleasures and desires and pains as far as he can. That the soul of every man, when it feels violent pleasure or pain in connection with some object, inevitably believes at the same time that what causes such feelings must be very clear and very true. This is why it's so difficult. This is why we continue to imprison ourselves. Because think of the most vivid experiences in your life. Those ones that are stuck most in your memory. It's very likely that those extremely vivid experiences were either very, very pleasurable and exciting and enjoyable, or very, very painful. In particular, if they were very painful, right? There's something about pain that you just can't deny. It's seared in your memory. Something that was very hurtful, very painful, is hard to forget. And those experiences are the most vivid. And what Plato is saying here is, because those experiences seem the most vivid, that makes us think that this is what life genuinely is about. And so we continually seek after pleasure, and it just builds up those same bad habits. It just makes it more difficult to eventually turn away from the body and seek philosophical knowledge. The way he describes this, again, every pleasure or pain provides, as it were, another nail to rivet the soul to the body and to weld them together, and makes the soul corporeal. Now, again, let's put away the metaphysics of the soul for a minute. Imagine that you are stuck in a situation where you're giving into some temptation. Imagine that there's some goal you have in life, but because of your laziness and sloth, you simply can't get going. You can't get started. And oftentimes that really is the most difficult thing. You have some goal you want to accomplish. The most difficult thing is just getting going. So ask yourself, why are you in that situation? Why is it so hard to just get started on a path that you know is good for you, that you know you want? One way to explain it is that you have built up so many habits, whether it's pursuing a pleasure or not being able to avoid some sort of pain you need to undergo. You've built up so many habits of, being lazy and slothful that it's very difficult to get yourself out of those. This is the sort of thing that addiction is made of as well, to various sorts of substances, alcohol, addiction to various drugs. In a sense, your body has built up so many habits and such a need for the alcohol, for the drug, that it's simply hard to even see your way out. And one thing I want to emphasize is just how disempowering and how out of control this can actually make you feel. And I think this is, whether you accept Plato's claims about the soul or not, I think this is a really big takeaway. Because there's one final aspect I really want to consider about this body as prison metaphor. Plato says that philosophy is freeing. It frees you from the imprisonment. Your pursuit of the needs and pleasures of the body has imprisoned you. It's built up the bad habits that prevent you from turning toward what is truly real, from escaping your imprisonment. Philosophy is what allows you to escape. And we should recall here that what he really means is your use of reason, which is the province of the soul. That leads to freedom. Giving into your senses, your pleasures, your emotions, the thing of the body, that leads to imprisonment and enslavement. And we might wonder, why is that? Why is it connecting philosophy and reason with freedom? And I think the place to start here is to think about the phrase, a slave to our emotions. Right? You have likely been in a situation where you say that, I wish I didn't act that way, but I feel out of control. I feel I can't control myself. I feel like I'm a slave to my body, to my desires, to my emotions. And of course, if you say you're a slave to those things, or you're controlled by those things, that would be a significant impediment on your freedom. But we might think, like, why is that the case? Like, how can you be controlled or enslaved by your own emotions and your pleasures? No one is forcing you to do anything. So to get at this point, I want to compare these following two situations. So first situation I'll call coercion. Ryan is kidnapped by a group of evil people who hate his friend David. The group wants David to feel as badly as possible, and they know that nothing will make him feel worse than being insulted by a friend. So the group threatens to harm Ryan's family unless Ryan insults David at a party this weekend. Okay, so here's a case where Ryan has this choice, insult David or not, but he's under threat by this very nefarious group that says he's going to harm his family. Right, so you can see certainly there's some pressure to make one decision over another. Consider another case, intoxication. Ryan gets drunk at a party and while intoxicated, insults his friend David. So let's say in both of these situations, Ryan chooses to insult David. And let's say later on, Ryan tries to explain why he did that. In the first case, he would say, look, it wasn't up to me. It wasn't my fault. I had this band of nefarious lunatics who said if I didn't insult you, that they were going to harm my family. So it wasn't my fault. That wasn't me talking. That's an interesting phrase. It wasn't me talking. Well, who was talking? Notice that we say a same thing in the case of intoxication. Ryan gets drunk at a party and while intoxicated insults his friend. The next day I might go to David and say, look, I was drunk last night. I know I said a lot of things that were hurtful, but that wasn't me. That wasn't really me. So, okay, well, who was it? And I think if you take that phrase seriously, there's a sense in which there are times where we act out of emotion or just immediate pursuit of pleasure or just our immediate passions. And on reflection, we say, that's not who I want to be, or that's not how I conceive myself to be. You might say, well, I was drunk. It was the alcohol talking. That wasn't me. I'm not someone who insults my friends. You might say, look, it was the nefarious lunatics who were talking. They forced me to insult you. I didn't want to do it. And so I think this claim about identity is really what's going on here. Both of these cases show what I might call the self-origination principle. One, you only act freely to the extent that you, and not some external influence, is the ultimate source of your actions and decisions. So, and that seems right? That's the idea behind the alcohol example. Look, it wasn't me talking with the alcohol. It was an external influence that made me do it. And you might say, well, what does this have to do with the present topic? And I would describe it in the following way, but I want to look at one of the very late passages from the Phaedo, in which we have basically Socrates' final words. Here's what Socrates says to his friends. "Bury me in any way you like," said Socrates, "if you can catch me and I do not escape you." And laughing quietly, looking at us, he said, "He, Crito, thinks that I am the thing that he will soon be looking at as a corpse. And so he asks how he shall bury me. I have been saying for some time and at some length that after I've drunk the poison, I shall no longer be with you, but will leave you to go and enjoy some good fortunes of the blessed. Bury it in any way you like." Notice a couple things here. Plato has Socrates say, you can bury me in any way you like if you can catch me. Because, of course, after his death, Socrates doesn't think he'll be here anymore. His corpse will be there, his body will be there, but he will not be there, because he is his soul and he will have left. And notice at the very end, he doesn't say bury me any way you like anymore. He says bury it in any way you like. He refers to his body as an it, as an object, as a sort of material thing, but he doesn't identify with it. And this is an important point, because remember, for Plato, what you are is your soul. You are not your body. So now put all these points together. We're saying that you only act freely to the extent that you, and not some external source, are the origin of your actions. What you are is your soul. You are not your body. That means if what is causing you to act is your desire for pleasure, is your immediate passions, is your immediate emotions, then you are not the source of your actions. Your body is. And if you are not the source of your actions, you are not free. That's why, going back up to the previous diagram, we're only truly free when we act according to reason. Because reason is the province of the soul. When we use our reason to determine what is truly real, when we use our reason to understand the forms, that is when we're free. When we give in to our senses, to our pleasures, to our emotions, when we give in to our body, that's when we're allowing something that's not us to determine our actions. It's like being coerced by the nefarious gang. It's like allowing alcohol to speak for you in a way you wouldn't want to speak. And so this is why Plato sees philosophy as freeing. It's not just that it allows you to live an immortal afterlife, but it's that it allows you to live a life in which your actions come from what you really are. Because what you really are is a soul, what you really are is the ability to reason, and everything else needs to be rejected and left behind. Everything else just confuses you from what's truly real and what's truly good. Okay, so I will stop there. I hope this gives some further explanation and illumination as to the connection between the body and the soul in Plato. And so I will stop there. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next video.